We have here today Professor William Johnsen from Michigan State University,
Yeah.
and editor of Contagion and editor of two book series, who has kindly agreed to talk to us about Professor René Girard and his memories of how he met René Girard and the time that he spent with René Girard. So let me start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard, and what drew you to him?
I was at Michigan State University even, and I started in 1970, and in 1973, one of René's students, Michael Koppisch from Hopkins, invited him to come to campus. And there was another former, I think he was a student of his, but he knew him at Buffalo, Clint Goodson. And so he gave a couple of lectures, one on the plague, and I had read in advance Out of Deceit, Desire in the novel. He was very interesting, of course, in reading him. And the lecture on the plague was just amazing. I was absolutely soaked in Northrop Frye. And I'm a modernist, and my specialization was modern writing, especially James Joyce. And so what I got from Frye is the theory of modes, the declining hero from the gods to the modern hero. But Northrop Frye was really a structuralist and never explained that, why they were descending. And that's what Girard gave me, and it was just astonishing. And I remember talking with him at a party at Michael Koppisch's house. And I had discussed Girard with someone in my department who had been a student of his at Hopkins in the 50s. In fact, Girard had been on his dissertation committee. And he said, you know, how difficult Girard was, and how happy he was to argue with people and so on. And I found him entirely different. He was so congenial. At Michael's party, for some reason, we were passing around a big bowl of grapes. And so he ended up holding the bowl of grapes and handing them out to us as we circled around him, 3 or 4 people. And he was making my head explode by the things he said. You know the way, the cryptic way he talks. But I had started reading him, and I followed his idea on the plague, and it was the missing link for what I wanted to say about modern writing. And so my head was rocking back and forth while he was talking. At the same time, he was so sweet-tempered. So that was my introduction to him. And since this was the 70s, I had gone off to Leeds University on an exchange and teaching Shakespeare. And so I was reading up on René and read La Violence. And so, I had one of the first tryouts on reading Shakespeare through Girard, because we were reading the histories. Which even in the Shakespeare book he really doesn't talk about, and they are so ready to be read that way. I still don't quite know what my students up in Yorkshire thought of this way of reading, but so that got me hooked. And so, as a scholar working on the modern, I kept using René's ideas, and occasionally I would meet him at a conference or something, but I didn't really work with him in detail until someone invited me to come to cover, and that was in 1995. That was the first time I had, talked to him at length. And so I would see him at cover thereafter. And then when he and Bob Hamilton Kelly started up Imitatio, I was invited to join as the person involved in publications. And so that was still more time with him. And that's when somehow my life shifted from being a modernist to a Girardian. It's been good. It's been good.
So would you call yourself a modernist Girardian now?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's what Andrew McKenna calls me anyway.
Modernist Girardian. That's a little bit of paradox, though, isn't it?
No, it works out just fine.
It does?
I don't have any paradoxes to worry about at all. It's perfect.
Okay.
That they explain each other.
I see. Good. Do you have any good memories you can share with us from the time you were working with René?
Well, he's so fast. This would have been, maybe 2007, something like that. And he'd already been, retired for more than 10 years. And we were sitting next to each other listening to a lecture at Palo Alto. And not a public lecture, but it was one of these roundtable things that Robert Hamilton Kelly set up. And I'd been reading Ibsen. Part of my book on modernism, violence and modernism, covers Ibsen. And so I'm reading him in Norwegian and working out. And I remember this something that Girard had tracked through his own writing, the idea of the gift. And so I said, in Norwegian, gift, artig gift means, are you married? So to add to the other ideas of gift, and I was so proud of this because I worked on this. And, we're listening to a lecture and then he just turned to me and says, oh yeah, gifted. His mind at that place was running so fast. So that's my experience of him, really, that he says these wonderful things that God knows how his mind really worked, but he would condense it so fast. And this isn't something I heard him say, but it was something I read of his. I was before cover. I did go to the conference in 1982, the Disorder Order Conference. And that was tremendous. Jean-Pierre Dupuy brought, I don't know how many Nobel Prize. Everybody was famous except me. I mean, I recognized all these names except my own. And what Jean-Pierre did was connect up Girard's ideas about moving from disorder to order to these powerful other ideas of physicists and so on. But I just recently read this quote where René was asked about where order comes from. And he said, well, disorder, where else would it come from? So you sit with that for about 5 seconds, you say, that's how his mind works. I mean, that these other Nobel Prize winners like Ilya Prigogine and so on, they have this wonderful scholarship of and research about how order emerges from disorder. But Schroer says, well, where else would it come from?
Right.
So there are so many little stories like that. It's just a different mind. Violence in the sacred. I mean, where in heaven's name did that come from? That just moves so fast that and you can retrace. And we published a kind of biography of Girard by Cynthia Haven, and it still doesn't explain how his mind incorporated that material, the material of myth and archaic cultures and anthropological studies and so on. That's just amazing. That's just amazing. I remember you had asked me before about did I have a favorite book, and somehow maybe it's because of the work I do. I'm always working on Girard and doing my teaching and so on. So most times he just gives me what I need. So if I identify a book I was just reading The Scapegoat, Bouc Émissaire. I wanted to read it in the Rouge edition, the red edition, the one you put together. And I would say with a proper sense of self-deprecation, I missed a lot, but it was giving me just what I needed. And so, on the one hand, I get a bad grade for missing a lot, but who cares? Because I'm getting just what I need to do the work I'm doing now.
Why do you say you're missing a lot? I don't get that. In what sense are you missing a lot?
Missing a lot. Well, I must have missed a lot because there was a lot of stuff in there that looks like it's new to me. And it probably just means I wasn't ready to use all of it at any one time.
Oh, I see what you mean.
So, that book always seemed to me, Girard's address to the misunderstandings that followed his work. And there's a kind of urgency in that book, I think, that comes from, how can you not understand this? Where he switches over to the text of persecution and just says simply, look at how we all read this. Is there anybody that doesn't read them this way, that the witches are not guilty, the Jews are not guilty? Well, just switch that reading over to myth. Why aren't we reading myths that way when we recognize the same structure reappearing? So, I mean, I got that, but there are all these beautiful things in there. And, you know, you would know this, sometimes the English translations just drop things out. So des choses cachées, there's all kinds of things that are dropped out of there, like his comments on Faulkner and race. And in the case of Bouc émissaire, there's some beautiful passages on Sophocles, where he claims Sophocles as a more ardently or strongly as a fellow researcher who's wondering whether these myths are not told in the correct way. You know, that they, so that the criticism of Girard that he had chosen, cherry-picked Sophocles, he turns that argument inside out and says that it's not me, it's Sophocles gathering material, enough material about the myth to make you wonder what it's about, what its motive is. So for me, I just keep going from text to text.
From text to text, from book to book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So in all these years, I guess 70, you said you encountered Girard. In all these years, what's your favorite book of his? You have one.
Yeah, I think if my first answer is I really don't have one. I have different reasons for admiring them. Violence in the Sacred is so sudden and so powerful and so beautifully written. It's almost like a detective novel, the way he spins it out. And he's been criticized, of course, by Eric Gans for not putting his theory of desire up front and just, you know, walking out of deceit, desire on the novel straight to Violence in the Sacred.
Right.
But I think it's such a powerful book because it has a new subject, that violence is a bigger subject than desire. You know, there are occasions of violence that only have minimally to do with desire. They're fighting over real things, and they're not drawn to them by desire, but necessity. And Girard's analysis of violence includes those as well as the occasions created by desire. So, I mean, so I agree with the organization as well as these. It's so pithy in a way that he will just pick up, because you know, this I suppose if you're doing a biographical approach, this is a very not combative. He said combative, but I think it's he's willing to engage with anybody. And there are those videos you can see on the French group, the ARM group Connect, and he's leaning into these discussions. He's chin in, you know, and happy to argue about these things. So the way he flips Levi-Strauss, this isn't fair. I mean, I read Levi-Strauss along with Northrop Frye. I have immense admiration for him, as does Girard. But he just catches somebody and turns them upside down. So when Levi-Strauss says the myth always, you know, accounts for the so-called biological facts, and he just flips them over and says these biological facts come from, you know, the sternness of ritual and taboo. That it's only when women's, for example, sexual behavior is regulated, you could even discover the so-called biological facts. So it's delightful in that way. And I remember as well the flipping of Freud in favor of the child, the last to learn that he's wants to kill his father and marry his mother. Right. So maybe that's a favorite because it's there's so much in there without it being overwritten. It's just beautifully written.
That's true. Very subtle and very precise.
Yeah.
He's always been very precise with his writing.
Yeah.
That's true. Did you also know, I guess it's redundant to ask, you probably, do you have any memories of Martha Girard?
Of course, yeah. I really like her. I met her first in Chicago. There was a conference there, part of the School of Criticism at Northwestern. And just to meet, to say hello. But during the times of cover that would meet once a year, we would sit together, the four of us, my wife and I, Rosemary and Martha and Renee. And if it was ever going to be possible to have not a normal, but a kind of unfussed relation to Renee, it was during those times. We just sat at a picnic table and talking about stuff. And the hard part of Girard is to be dumbfounded by him, that his work is so remarkable. And say, this man's a genius. How do I talk to him? And she was really good and she's a really cool woman. I really like her, and I still keep in touch with her. And when we're anywhere near California, I go up and visit her. She's one of a kind. She's, I can't imagine what it was like. I mean, it's there in the biography about how they met and so on, but still, he's a handful, and his one way you can read Martha is the way Renee always treated her. She was always treated with respect. She was his partner, and they would talk together. I think sometimes she'd say to him, I remember one time, this was at Canada, where she started bugging him. She said, "You didn't prepare enough to say that," that he hadn't been respectful enough, I suppose you would say, of his ideas. So she was the real thing. I mean, she still is the real thing, but she was involved in his thinking. And I remember once my wife and I were both in cover at that time, Rosemary, my wife Rosemary, and she had invited Martha to be on a panel to talk about René's work. She thought about it for a long time and decided not to. I wish we had talked her into it. I would love to have heard that, but at the same time, I respect that. I don't even have the words to describe what my respect is looking at, what I am respecting, but I think I understand it. I think I have a kind of feeling for why she decided finally not to. Because she said, yeah, well, I know a lot about it.
This was at a cover conference?
Yeah, that was a cover conference. It was, it
would
have been.
René has passed away?
No, it was before, but he wasn't, until, I don't remember what the subject of the panel was. It was before he passed away. Okay. Right.
I see. Okay. Do you remember any moment when you were talking with René which was not about anything profound, something down to earth?
Oh yeah. Sure. There's a wonderful picture of René with my wife Rosemary. We were at this conference in Canada, and we were at some kind of dorm, and the food was terrible. So we were talking about how terrible the food was, and he wasn't mean or critical or anything, or it wasn't anything like I'm French and this food is terrible. It was just any place on the planet you did, it wasn't good. And he was. I remember once when we were in New Mexico at Ghost Ranch, and it was a good time because people had time to talk to each other. We were all in the same place, and nobody was driving off going anywhere else. And René came up in a rented car, a Jaguar. Bob Andrew and Kelly, who always traveled in a high style, had rented a Jaguar. So they came up in the Jaguar and they got out. And René was wearing jeans, he was wearing blue jeans. And so, they came up and we were talking to them, and they were handing out drinks, and somebody handed him a bottle of Budweiser, and Maria Stella Barberi, who's a wonderful woman, from Sicily. She's someone who's done a lot of work on Girard, very smart woman. And she says, Professor Girard, or René Girard, is a Frenchman. You can't just hand him a bottle of Budweiser. And he tipped it back so elegantly and drank from it. He looked like the Marlboro Man with his jeans on and drinking you know what I mean? And It was easy. He was easy at being okay and down to earth, you know.
Yeah.
Wasn't trying to flash anybody or impress anybody, you know.
Yeah. What are some of the traits that you would attribute to René? When you first met him, how did he strike you? Was he the big giant intellectual that you had imagined him to be?
Well, you know, a part of it, I would be going back that first time I met him when I had been prepared. I thought to meet him that he was difficult. And reading between the lines and the way he talked about himself his early days, I think he says about himself that he had done too much to form a clique at Hopkins, you know, that made a break between the older faculty and René and fellow students and so on. And I think it's out of that period that my colleague in the English department, Bernie Paris was his name, very good man. And he had prepared me out of that this man is difficult and he might go after you and so on. And so my first experience was not at all so friendly, so kind, handing me grapes while he's giving me, you know, my reading plan for the next 50 years. So, I mean, that continued. That meeting we were at, if you remember, that fool who started accusing us of being some clique or you know, some kind of groupies around Girard. And then I think it was Sandy Girard who asked René, who was sitting in the audience, he says, well, you have a chance to answer this. And René just said, I do not recognize myself in the person he is describing. And that was so cool. That was so cool. I remember how hot you were. I remember that. You were ready to go. I think I said, we should probably just sit here because I could feel you edging up towards the towards the microphone. So I think that stands for him, that even at a place where he could have said, you know, what are you talking about? You know, and that was so, it was unkind, it was rude. He was an invited guest to talk about Girard and, you know, to say those things. And
was he the
Johnny
one?
Johnny Vattimo, as you remember, got up and said in his part of the talk, and said, well, you know, René doesn't need anybody to defend him. So that was another way of settling it. So I suppose those are the points I think of when you ask about what he was like, you know.
You're right. Okay, very good. So what are your current projects and future projects you have in terms of continuing with René Girard's work? Do you have anything specific? Any books you want to write, or in addition to your editing?
Yeah. Well, I want, you know, the editing, of course, comes first, and I see it as being much more effective than my own writing. That's just the truth. That's the way it goes. So right now, the series continues. So we publish about 4 books a year. Ideally, 2 books in the Breakthrough series and 2 books in the Studies in Violence, Mimesis, and Culture. Right now, the very thing I'm working on is we got the rights to an amazing conversation that René had in 1972 in the offices of Esprit in Paris. This was published in Esprit, and it's the place where he comes out of violence and the sacred. You remember he did add, he took out the parts on the Bible as being, I think he wanted to defend them more properly, a little worried that it'd be taken out of context. But there in the discussion, he just lays it all out. And it's stupendous. And it's one of those places where he's taking out all comers. There's about 5 or 6 different interlocutors, Pierre Pache and so on, and others who just lean in and ask questions. And he just keeps hitting it out of the park. And so this has never been translated. So Andrew McKenna, one of his early students, has translated it into English. And Andreas Wilmes, who's very strong young Girard scholar, has written a preface to it. So we'll publish that probably fall of 2021. Giuseppe Fornari's books, 2 books, 2 volumes. This is huge. It's just his version of emetic theory beginning from practically the archaic world up to present time. That'll appear maybe in the next month, 6 weeks or so on. So COV&R is really important as, I was going to talk about my work, right? I wasn't going to talk about editing. So my writing, very simply, what I'm working on now is a kind of second step or stage from my first book. My first book was Violence and Modernism. And I did Ibsen, Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. And I tried to amalgamate Northrop Frye with Girard, to try to establish how it was that the modern comes at the end of this period of, whether you call it deconstruction or disenchantment or whatever. And this next book is on, I'm going to try to amalgamate Edward Said and René Girard. And I remember a discussion we had, because I was asking you, I figured out since you had worked in Said's department, I said, well, how exactly do you reconcile those? Because Said wasn't very good on Girard. You would never go to Said and find out what Girard was doing. He just washed his hands of it. But you told me, and I remember this very well, I'm going to put it in my introduction, because I thought you would tell me something technical. And instead you said, Edward Said was our hero. I'll never forget that. And he was my hero too. I mean, I met him in the 60s at Illinois. He was there at the Center for Advanced Study. And so I'll be writing about Conrad. The idea is to use Girard and Said to extend the reading, to continue the reading that Said was doing of Conrad. Because I think he was almost at the point where he could say more in defense of Conrad than he had just dated colonialism. Because I think if you look at Conrad's work very carefully, he's doing much more. He's showing how colonialism is exploding up itself, and it wouldn't disappear by itself. It requires pressure from others. It's the necessity of taking opportunity in a moment of weakness of colonialism, because it could have sewed itself up back again, but it didn't. And so I think that's where Conrad comes in. So it's on Conrad and Achebe. So Things Fall Apart seems to me perfectly the perfect novel for the post-colonial, because everything is in it. He is an anthropologist in René's sense, showing how things fall apart. And then finally, the third person I'm writing about is Dermot Bolger, who's an Irish writer, not much known in the United States. And I think he is the best example I can think of who talks about, he's very much against post-colonialism. I mean, he says that this is just a straitjacket thrown on Irish writers. They should have nothing to do with it. Just taking these ideas that have been worked out somewhere else and just stamping them. And so his version of being Irish is very loose. If you were once in Ireland, you're Irish. If you're living there now, if you're Polish or Hungarian emigre, you're Irish. And he says in the preface to his a series of 3 plays he wrote about public housing in Dublin, he says that every movement has to, and Said just lays this out in Culture and Imperialism, that every movement has to talk about how it's been hurt. That you have to go there first. You have to say, this is how I've been hurt. And he quotes Fanon about how you need to move on, of course, if you can't just stay there. And that has a lot of resonance in Irish culture, that they themselves criticize themselves for always talking about the troubles in our native land, all the sufferings and doing the poor mouth. And Bolger's so good at that, because he says that there's a time where you have to move on and create a new Ireland. You have to leave that stuff behind. So we'll see how it works out.
That sounds fascinating.
Well, yeah, it's really good. It's good for me. But, nevertheless, I probably spend 75 or 80% of my time on doing the editing.
Right.
And I can see how this has influence, has effect. And my writing, well, I'd love to make that case for Conrad, because I love Conrad, and it's so easy to beat him up. I wrote an essay, published an essay in Conradiana in 2003, the same year my book came out, on his third novel, the one he said made him a writer. Right. And it uses the N-word in the title, and that's been the kiss of death, for that book. And then I deal with the Che-based criticisms of Conrad, which I refuse to quarrel with the Che, but I think there's a point that you go beyond that. That the first person that recognizes the insults to the racist insults is Conrad himself, especially in that third novel.
What did you think of Apocalypse Now, the film? Did you ever see that?
Yeah, sure. It's just different. I don't think it has much to do with Conrad.
No?
You know, I published Nidesh Latu's book on Conrad. Very, very successful book. It got the Conrad Award from the Conrad Society for the best book on Conrad for a 2-year period. And he goes into that at length. But it's a cool movie, you know, a very effective movie. But I don't.
But it's not.
Don't spend time thinking about them together.
Right. Right. Yeah. Just as a footnote, Edward Said was at the conference that Girard organized in Johns Hopkins. Did you know that?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you can see that in the comments.
In the
Doesn't
comments.
get a lot of attention. He probably said more than that, you know.
So that was there too. Good.
Well, he was a hotshot even then. I mean, he's right out of grad school.
Yeah.
And it's too bad that they didn't spend more time on each other's work, because in some ways they're alike. They're two scholars who were not fireballs when they were young students. And you get the impression that Said just goofed off a lot or felt so at odds with his education that it wasn't until, you know, really he had writing his dissertation that people could see how incredible he was.
Right.
Yeah, you know, I admired him because he never it wasn't someone who kept changing jobs in order to increase his, you know, whatever, his salary or his influence or whatever. He just stayed at Columbia. That was fine. That's remarkable, very rare.
And what they both had in common was they were both out of place.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. That's a quote. I know. Yeah.
They were both out of place.
Yeah.
Girard made a real career out of being out of place, and so did Said.
Yeah. I miss them both. You know, it seems like we're living in a world now where Edward Said isn't. That's as simple as I can say it.
Right. Wonderful. So, well, I'm really happy. I'm very excited for all the work you're doing, because I spoke to Giuseppe Fornari, and he told me about the book that he was.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So he was very happy and very excited about the book. So he told me, and now you're telling me about the book. So I'm looking forward to seeing it when it comes out. So that's wonderful. So
that's great.
Well,
that's great.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk and share your memories and thoughts on René Girard, Professor René Girard, I would say, and I hope to see you soon.